thank you for coming out this evening as we have our forum on What's the Buzz about Common Core. As you may have heard, there's been a lot of buzz and chatter about Common Core, and there's been movement in our schools as far as motions to remove it. Carolyn Gargasz and I sponsored this forum because we thought it would be a very good idea for people to understand just what it was. So what we did was we pulled together a panel of subject matter experts. We have people from the Department of Education, the Board of Education, Nashua Community College, which is affiliated with Granite College and other four-year institutes. We have Fred Kocher from WMUR Business. We also have a teachers panel that we will introduce you to in a few moments, but first we're going to hear from Representative Gargasz as she sets the guidelines that we have for tonight.
Thank you, Melanie. And I just have to say, Melanie has done all the hard work on this. I'm just here as a co-host, but I want to give her credit for all that she has done. And thank all these people that she has gathered to speak to you tonight. The speakers are going to talk for about 10 minutes each. First, the panel on the far left, my far left, and then the panel of teachers here. And you received this when you came in, and in it is a 3x5 card, or maybe it's a 4x6. And if you have questions, we've asked the speakers to address questions that we've heard. So if you still have questions that they haven't answered, please write your questions down on a card. We will collect them, and then at the end, and for about a half an hour, if we have that much time, we'll be answering questions. We'll be posing the questions to the speakers. And so I welcome you all, and I hope that you have a really interesting, productive learning experience tonight.
Thank you, Representative Gargasz. Just want to add a couple other housekeeping rules here. When you fill out a card, there is somebody here that's going to collect them and sort them, and we designated Mary Ann, where you are, Mary Ann, so she's going to collect the cards, and if we get more questions on one issue, we definitely want to make sure that that's addressed. So make sure Mary Ann gets the cards. And for our speakers, we only have 10 minutes per speaker. So we have a timer up front. Caitlin is our timer, and she'll let you know when you're at 8 minutes, and then she's going to give you the hook at 10. Okay? So I would like to start our illustrious panel. I just want to introduce the panel. We have Tom Raffio, who is the chair of the Department of Education for New Hampshire, and he's also the CEO of Delta Dental. We have Heather Gage, who is with the Department of Education. Lucille Jordan, who is the president of the Nashua Community College, and Fred Kocher, who is the host of WMUR Business, and also the former president of New Hampshire High Tech Council. These folks are going to tell you why Common Core, how it was conceived and put in place. And at this time, I'd like to give the floor to Tom.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming tonight. I know we're competing with the soccer game, and you may have noted it was 1-0 U.S. At halftime, so you can put yourself to ease on that. I know Hollis Brookline is a big soccer town. I want to thank the representatives for organizing this educational event, and I especially want to thank the teachers for coming tonight, because that's who you really want to hear from, and they're in the middle of a busy season, so thank you all colleagues for coming. I really look forward to this tonight. One of the things I've been doing as chair of the State Board of Education is getting out in the community and listening and hopefully educating, and that actually starts with, I hope you, when you leave tonight, if you haven't already taken a copy, take an actual set of the Common Core standards for math and the English language arts, and please look at them so you'll know what they actually are. And I think you'll see that while they are indeed high, they are achievable expectations that I think you would want your child and student to master. I'll be speaking tonight as chair of the State Board of Education. Fred is here, so he'll also speak from a business perspective, but I also am chair of a coalition called the New Hampshire Coalition for Business and Education. So Fred will handle that part of this. I'll speak mostly in my role as chair of the State Board of Education, which I've been on the board since 2007 and chair the last couple years. So I believe that this as Common Core is the most important advance in public education in a generation. And here's why I say that. Think back to the days of No Child Left Behind, and you'll hear this from the teachers, that was all about testing. Teachers felt they were forced to teach to the tests. I was just talking to them, and to try to make the adequate yearly progress and avoid being labeled a school in need of improvement. So really, teachers under No Child Left Behind were scrambling. So for example, the 5th grade match teacher started at the beginning of the book and got as far as she or he could by the end of the year. Some students kept up, some got bored, some fell behind, but the teacher kept going because the curriculum covered so much. And then, since the 6th grade teacher didn't know what her incoming or his incoming students could do, she or he would review all that and teach fractions all over again. And maybe the students might never get good at fractions. And so, what if someone came from a different school? Well, Groveton High School had a 30% turnover just between October and January last year, so neither the student nor the teacher would know what to expect. As a result, our students were not as good at math and reading on the international test as students from other countries around the world. And more importantly, and we've heard this from the chair of the community college system, Paul Holloway, students coming into the community college system needed so much remedial work in math. So the Common Core is one part, a very important part, of our efforts to let our teachers teach and our standards learn in a focused and coherent way, and you'll hear from them later on. And that's what I've seen happen over my 7 or 8 years on the State Board of Education. And I can tell you, the State Board of Education board members, we talk to hundreds of teachers every year. Some of our board meetings are held in schools. We're constantly at different events. And we always ask the teachers about their experience with the Common Core. And virtually every teacher who's used the new standards in his or her classroom agree that they are a big step forward. So you'll hear from them tonight. You should be proud of the fact that Hollis Brookline has committed early and thoroughly to the new standards. So how did we adopt the Common Core? I remember back 7 years ago when the Department of Education and the State Board was working on the early stages of what then became the Common Core. Early on, before the standards writing ever got started, the department team was meeting with their counterparts all across the country. New Hampshire, just so you know, had last updated our standards, the grade level expectations, or GLEs, in 2006, and we knew it would be a multi-year process to update it. Then in 2009, when the process got started in earnest, under the sponsorship of the National Governors Association and the education commissioners in each state, we got really involved. So this was not a federal takeover of education. The department, people like Heather and others, got on the phone every month to talk about the Common Core with the lead authors, about the direction their thinking was taken. A recently retired employee at the Department of Education, Deb Wiswell, assembled a whole team at the department to provide that kind of feedback. And there'd be people on these calls from New Mexico and from New York, and we had many of these teleconferences, all going sort of back and forth with a good give and take. These conversations tend to talk about broader concepts, but we would get very specific in terms of what are your thoughts on this or that standards. So New Hampshire has a small team, so it was natural to prepare for these calls by reaching out across state lines and saying, let's start digging into this and see what feels right and what doesn't. So I must tell you, the writers were open to our recommendations. We proposed, for example, that speaking should be part of the language arts standards. So people like me, when they get into their 50s, would do a better job. And from then on, speaking became part of the standards. That's just one simple example. In another case, the New Hampshire team pushed to include science and social studies in the language arts standards. Many states agreed, so Achieve included science and social studies as part of the language arts standards. So it's in there now, so that was a huge deal. It was during one of these calls that we said something that's been very useful here in New Hampshire is a tabular layout so the teachers can see kindergarten, first grade, second grade expectations all together and then follow to see the progression from grade to grade. And sure enough, the Common Core, as these teachers were verified, the language arts standards were formatted just that way, just like the old New Hampshire grade level expectations document. And people were thrilled. Again, that was huge. So the first draft came out in January of 2010, and then we held more meetings all over the state. We invited superintendents, assistant superintendents, curriculum leaders in each district to structured feedback sessions. Anyone who wanted to get involved was involved, and we were very transparent. It was winter and we had a tight time frame, but we still had 217 educators by our documentation from across the state to give us feedback on these standards. Each meeting spent 3 hours in the morning on language arts and 3 hours in the afternoon on math. Some teachers continued their work back at their districts and then emailed additional feedback. And we saw the results of our work in the final standards. We got our New Hampshire feedback directly to the writers as they were actually writing the Common Core. So our educators right here in New Hampshire were a critical part of developing the Common Core. As one of the facilitators wrote to the R Department of Education, after reviewing the specific improvements that were made, I'm speechless. The public draft addresses almost all of our teachers' concerns using their suggested changes, simplifying phrasing, terminology, suggestions as examples. So it's clear if you compare the final document with the first document, they are so different in a positive way as a result of the process that it's clear how big a role that feedback from New Hampshire played. So we feel like, while we call it the Common Core, it's really the New Hampshire Common Core. It's our own best ideas enhanced by what educators and educators from 45 other states thought was important. And now we're beginning to see the fruits of this impressive results. So I've got the 2-minute warning. Let me close with 6 quick but important points. Cost. What about the cost? We're years down the road. All the superintendents say no new textbooks except on the normal cycle. No new technology and bandwidth beyond what's necessary for daily teaching. No new professional development beyond what they normally do every year. This from John Freeman, superintendent in Pittsfield. In Pittsfield, the use of the Common Core state standards has not resulted in any increased cost for us. Through our normal curriculum review cycle, we've used the Common Core state standards to revise and update our curriculum. Point number 2, what if a local school district wants to have more challenging standards? A-OK, go for it, God bless you. When a city like Manchester enhances the standards, they actually reconfirm how good the Common Core standards are, and as you probably read in the paper, they used most of what was in the Common Core. Number 3, be careful about media reports. For example, there's a recent New York Times article about the debate over use of cursive. Well, there was actually nothing in the Common Core that prevents teaching cursive. Point number 4, testing. Our testing is a major step into modern testing compared to the 10-year-old kneecap. As Scott McGilvray, head of the NEA, says, yes, smarter balanced assessment is much harder than what educators and kids are used to, but that's the whole point. And here from another assistant superintendent, when we ask students to do a performance task, we often get to a level of understanding that we just cannot get in any other form of assessment. And 2 final points. Student data privacy. New Hampshire is nationally known to have the toughest student data privacy protections in the country. Among other things, our statute says, under no circumstances shall personally identifying information or unique pupil identifier be provided to any person or entity outside New Hampshire. So it's not an issue because of the Common Core. And finally, there is no ability at this point to opt out of the Common Core or the testing. So thank you, and I know you will enjoy the rest of the evening, and I'm only 30 seconds over, Melanie, so thank you. Heather, you'll only go 9 minutes and 30 seconds, right?
I'm looking for the hook from you. Melanie, do you also have the clicker that I might be able to?
Clicker.
It's right, it should be right there. Perfect. Thank you, Representative. I really appreciate it. So again, my name is Heather Gage, and I am absolutely thrilled to be here. This is my first time in your auditorium, and it's beautiful. So I want to just give you kind of a little bit of a, let me make sure a little bit of a topic organizer. So when Representative Levesque asked me to come in, she wanted me to make sure that I address these concerns that she has heard from the community. And basically, how are we implementing the Common Core? What's the state's role in support in that? Who has implemented Common Core standards in New Hampshire? And I'll kind of share some information around there. And then what's happening with the assessments, and also what's the state doing to address privacy concerns? And Tom got us started on those conversations. I want to go just a little bit deeper into a few areas. So. As many of you probably already know, the state has, by state requirements through law, we have to have frameworks, standard frameworks in certain content areas. And that is to be able to provide a roadmap for schools. It's not to dictate what happens in the classroom, but just a roadmap for what we want students to know and be able to do. The Common Core state standards are the standards that the state has determined to use for two subject areas, English language arts and mathematics. Now you heard Tom also mention the fact that in our English language arts standards, you will see how we're going to be helping students read not only our wonderful novels and those kinds of things, and I think our teachers will speak much better about that, but also how are we ensuring that kids can understand informational text in sciences, in the social studies areas, and other areas. And so it's all about that reading and how we can come together to ensure that kids are where they need to be. But I did want to show this graphic just so you can see that there are standards in other areas as well that are also very, very important. The Common Core is just in those two content areas. So going back to the first topic that I wanted to talk to you about, so when we talk about on this side of the table, if you will, or this side of the stage, implementation of policy and supports from the state level. What we think is even more important is the implementation of practice. And so we're going to try and talk real quickly because we want you to hear from these amazing teachers over here and the work that they're doing in their classroom. There's also this conversation around the difference between standards versus curriculum and instructional practice. And Tom mentioned this as well. There is an intentional design limitation when it comes to the Common Core standards or any state level standards. And that is that it is, if you look at these standards, one of these standards may say in a particular grade level that kids will learn fractions. It does not tell you how the teacher will teach those fractions. And we all know that there are probably, I don't know, maybe 100 different ways of teaching that. And that is up to the people that went to school and have the pedagogy and those kinds of things to teach those standards. So I have two analogies that are terrible, but it's really, if you look at these two, there's a difference between holding a roadmap, standards, and driving the car, what happens in that classroom. Or you can talk about the difference of pouring a foundation and actually building that house and what that house looks like and the supports that are in that, and that's what happens in the classroom. So there's also local design and opportunities. What's really important, what I hope you leave here understanding, is that your local school district or SAU in Hollis Brookline has the opportunity to take these standards and they can use them to inform the Hollis Brookline standards. They can use them as just a guidepost. They don't have to use them at all. It's completely a local decision on whether or not you adopt these particular standards or not. Now, what you'll hear back is, well, we have this assessment. I'm going to talk about the assessments in just a minute, so we're going to put a pin in that. But if most school districts who want to use the standards to inform are going above and beyond what these minimum standards are saying kids need to know and be able to do. And we'll talk a little bit about that. Career paths, for example, if you want to make sure that every one of your kids in your school district is ready to go into STEM fields, then you can have a career path that goes beyond what the Common Core has laid out in that roadmap and put together a STEM path for your students. Completely a local opportunity. and design. It's an expected floor, not a ceiling, and those kinds of things. So state support. We at the Department of Education are the first to admit we don't have everything that we need at the state level. We need to partner with state associations, with local associations, including New Hampshire NEA, which we have a great partnership with, as well as the Administrators Association and Principals Association. We all come collaboratively together to help provide supports for those districts who ask. Districts have relationships with lots and lots of people around the state and nationally to help them with whatever standards they decide to use, and we're fully, fully supportive of that. So the other question, or the second question there is, who has implemented Common Core? So because the state doesn't dictate that you have to adopt Common Core as it is written in this document, that it is a roadmap, we currently don't collect who is adopting it fully just the way it is or other places. Because we've had so many questions in the public over this last year about who's doing what, and including folks within education, we're looking for ways that we might be able to collect that information as a resource to the public. But if you ever have questions around who is implementing and who is not, I encourage you to go to local district websites, contact other local districts to find out how they're implementing as well, again, because of the local decision to adopt. The statewide assessment is required by state statute for all. It's a point-in-time measurement of student performance based on those state standards in mathematics and English language arts. However, at the local level, we would never, ever, ever fully support or support at all to be used as the only measure of student or school performance. I'll actually add another one in there. It should never be used as the only measure in teacher or administrator evaluations and those kinds of things. So it's just at one point of time. It can be used as a multiple measure to see how we're doing, but should never be the only indicator. So the other question was about assessment, right? We have a lot of questions about assessment. So first, let's talk about why we assess. And when I'm talking about the assessment, some of it's state assessment, some of it's interim, some of it's formative that happens in the classroom. There's multiple ways of assessing. So for many reasons that we assess, but some of the most important, and we could probably list 10 or 15 more here, but to improve teaching and learning. That's the thing, right? We want to make sure that kids are learning, that teachers have the supports they need to teach. It's also to evaluate and improve programs. So if your school district has chosen a particular curriculum in math, ELA, or what have you, one of the reasons to assess how students are learning is to also say, is this program doing what we want it to do, right? And then also to support accountability uses. And that's more at the state level, although local determinations and local accountability options can utilize a variety of different assessments. So then, let's talk about the assessment that the state is going to be using next year. Oh, 2 minutes. I'm going to blow by this and just basically tell you that next year we'll be using a new assessment. It is what we consider a much better way of assessing students in our 3 through 8 and 11th grade. Similar to, well, the concept is similar to NECAP. A lot of you have heard of that if you have students currently in schools. This is a replacement factor. So not only have we had standards for decades, and the Common Core or new standards in those 2 content areas, but we've also had statewide assessments for a very, very long time. And this is a new way of assessing students. So if you'll allow me, and I'm happy to take any questions, I'm going to go by these really quickly, because I also want to... a lot of people have been asking the question about our students with cognitive disabilities. There is currently an ALT assessment for our students that have those disabilities, and we'll continue to do that. So it's not Smarter Balance, it's a different assessment that's valid and more appropriate for our kids with the cognitive disability side. So the only other thing that I wanted to mention, and all of a sudden my clicker isn't working, is the privacy concerns. Am I one more minute? So with the privacy concerns, I wanted to let you know that New Hampshire is actually known for having some of the strictest student privacy laws in the country, and that just got more strict. Yay us. We're very proud of that. We take student privacy very, very seriously. We actually have a unique identifier to a unique identifier when it comes to Smarter Balance, so that there's no way of tracing those results back to a student when it comes to reporting. And with that, my time is up, and I'll turn it back over. Happy to take questions later.
Thank you, and again, I want to echo what everyone has said. I'm really pleased to have you here tonight to talk about Common Core. And I'd like to talk about it from the perspective of higher education and why in higher education we find this very important. And let me just give you a piece of data that I looked at today. Over the past 3 years, we have had 86 students from Hollis Brookline at our college, directly from the high school. 20% of those students have required developmental education. All of them have required developmental math. 5 of those have required developmental English, and 1 has required developmental reading. Now, the Common Core, it is our hope in higher education, implementing those standards at the bare minimum will now begin to align your curriculum with the expectations of college. And that is very important because it costs more for a student when they're taking and the parents, and more time when they're going through college. And it just does not happen at the 2-year level. It also happens at the 4-year level. At the 4-year level, what will happen is a student, rather than going into a English composition that is of a higher level, they might be in English 101. And that's really, they're going to have to take more English classes. It's not called remedial ed, but they're going to need to take more English classes to satisfy their general ed core. And so by doing the standards and aligning them with our expectations, 2 things will happen. 1, the student will not only be college ready, but we can begin to not assess students. We don't have to assess them every time they come in, because we know that that assessment has happened with a very solid background at the high school level. And that is really important to us. It is important in economic development. And when you think about and Tom mentioned this earlier, but students and families are no longer just locally, having just to be in the geography locally. They move around. You move around to different colleges. You move around to different places. And when all of the colleges, and many, many colleges across the United States have really adopted and supported my colleagues' Common Core, because they know what will result in that, and the students that we will receive, it'll shorten their time to graduation, which is so important. Right now, it is a long period of time. I've had, well, more than 2 students, but 2 examples that I can give you. I've had a student who right now is in pre-med at Johns Hopkins, a full ride to Johns Hopkins. He had to start out in developmental math because he didn't have the math requirements, and yet he really had it. But he had to learn how to learn, and that to me is what the Common Core will do, and I think the teachers will speak to that as well. It's changing some of what we do. We're learning how to learn because there's just too much information. I've had another student, developmental English. She went to Cornell, full ride to Cornell, graduated as an honor student, and was on the top of their magazine and all of those pieces. So many of our students transfer to us, but you know what happens to them? Instead of 2 years, they're taking 3 years to get through, and they're using a lot of their student loan and Pell money that they then won't have access for their baccalaureate degree. And for us as a society, that's important because we know, and I think Fred will talk to this as well, the importance of the college education in economy and how we can continue to support business and industry. So I think that this is a great tool for all of us in education to be able to look at, to use, and know that there are different ways in which you can do it. And as Heather said, it's not just one test, it's multiple measurements, which for us, again, we're not going to have to assess these students. And the students come to us and they have to take another assessment test, and then They're very worried about it. They find out that they have to take a remedial math. The parents are upset. And once again, because our curriculums need to be aligned with college expectations. I am going to stop there and turn it over to Fred.
Thank you. Good evening to all of you. First of all, let me tell you, I'm not here on behalf of WMUR TV, even though I do a show on Sunday morning, which I hope some of you watch. I'm here from the High Tech Council and from my own business, Kocher Company, Inc. I work with high-tech companies as well as education institutions, but I do not reflect anything from WMUR. They have not taken a position on Common Core. That's not what they do. They try to be a platform for news about education and for discussion, and which is what I try to do in my interview segment. So let me make that clear. Now, let me give you the business case for Common Core standards in my own words. It's very basic. It's the preparation, as previous speakers have said, for the competitive and complex world that they're entering, plus the generation of workforce for the businesses that need well-educated and skilled talent, which is increasingly hard to find. The world in which we now live requires more rigor and relevance on the part of the education we provide for our students. Common Core Standards provides the baseline for that rigor and relevance, and still allows local school districts to add their own standards to Common Core, and still allows teachers to teach students in ways that engage the students and their interests in learning. Key segments of the New Hampshire business community have supported Common Core. The Business Industry Association of New Hampshire, by the vote of its board, and the New Hampshire High Technology Council, of which I'm a trustee and former president. The New Hampshire Coalition for Business and Education, which has as its members executives of a number of New Hampshire companies. It's chaired by Tom Raffio. They support the Common Core standards. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And here's why. In 2012, I had the opportunity to sit in a room at the State House with former Governor John Lynch and the CEOs of 7 New Hampshire manufacturing companies. The governor had assembled them to ask what it would take to give manufacturing in New Hampshire a shot in the arm. After much discussion, the consensus was summarized in one word: math. Too few applicants for jobs in their companies have the necessary math knowledge to perform in their companies. Modern manufacturing demands a different and more technical skill set than the old industries. Workers must be proficient in math, science, and computers. They must be able to learn and relearn on the job on a daily basis. A recent report indicates there are up to 600,000 manufacturing jobs unfilled in the U.S. because of a lack of qualified candidates. And with that in mind, Common Core, with exceptions in some school districts, Common Core standards are more rigorous in math than most of the current old state standards. They ensure that all students are given the opportunity to master the math skills needed for success, to develop the ability to solve problems, and to understand the logic of math. Students who have mastered the Common Core will be ready to take higher level math coursework in high school and college, which will allow them to pursue their careers, and especially in the STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, and math. Now, here's some statistics. A key part of the business argument for Common Core. U.S. students rank 26th against their international counterparts on mathematics assessments. More than 30% of students enrolled in college require remedial math courses, and that costs students, parents, states, and our economy hard-earned cash, state tax dollars, and wasted resources. Approximately 27% of high school students in the U.S. don't graduate from high school, and only 40% go on to college. Meanwhile, the number of jobs requiring STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, will increase by an estimated 26% in the next 6 to 10 years, according to the Georgetown Center on Education and the Workforce. Part of the reason is due to the rising retirement rate, and the competition for jobs among many sectors of the economy. And it's not just about technical or job-specific skills. It's also about the 3 C's: critical thinking, collaboration, and communication. Soft skills that CEOs and their managers too often find missing in new employees. In short, we are unprepared to meet the current and future needs of manufacturers, software developers, energy companies, etc. And business leaders believe that Common Core standards will begin to turn that around and is part of the solution. Just let me finish by saying I have a grandson that was born this past August. He'll be a year old this year. And I thought about him and Common Core standards and what he'll be facing when he gets to school. And I've looked through the Common Core standards, and I really believe that he'll be challenged the right way to be the best he can be. And for me as a grandfather, that's pretty good.
Thank you, panel, for all your expert knowledge. And now we'll hear from those teachers who are the front lines of teaching Common Core standards. To your right is Jennifer Manning. She's a kindergarten teacher in Sanborn. Greg Snoke, who is a 6th grade math teacher in Brookline. Evan Czyzowski, I hope I have that right, is an English teacher in Sanborn. And Dot Ball, who is math teacher here at Hollis Brookline High School. And we will also be joined by Tammy Leonard when it's her time to speak. She's also a math teacher at Hollis Brookline High School. So we will start with Jennifer. Jennifer, are you okay with that mic, or do you want to come up here?
I'll try my best. You have to bear with me as I spend my day with little people. So I've been teaching kindergarten for 12 years, and when where I teach in Sanborn, I teach in Newton, and I have the unique experience of seeing a grade level start from the bottom. So I was the first kindergarten teacher there, and I've seen kindergarten progress over the past 10 years. And when I look back, I think that first year that I was in Newton, I didn't teach half of what I teach now. And the Common Core, when I think back to these past 2 years and what the Common Core has done for my teaching, I think that I feel really confident that I've created such a rich learning experience for these little minds, for these small children. As far as Common Core goes, from the teacher's perspective, I think when I think about the title for tonight, about what's the buzz about Common Core, because I question that. From my perspective in the classroom, I find it as a streamlined, focused set of standards that will help my students to achieve standards that I didn't think they could before. And the first time I sat down with the Common Core, I was concerned, and I thought, how can a kindergartner write an opinion piece, or how can they decompose numbers? It was concerning to me after my experiences that I had had teaching for the past 7 or 8 years. Can I really expect my students to do this? But what I found is that I have such a focus in my teaching that my students are learning more. One important piece that we need to remember about Common Core, especially for our young students, is that Common Core states right in there that with prompting and support, that we will support our learners to meet these standards. And I always have to remind myself that, because as the previous speakers said, districts can hold their students to a little bit of a higher standard. So sometimes I say, well, I want them to achieve that standard without my prompting and support. But it's there for all of our students. Another great thing that I've learned about the standards is that they build upon each other. So in kindergarten, students are comparing types of text, and in 1st and 2nd grade, they're doing that same standard. So I'm teaching them in kindergarten the standard at a developmentally appropriate level. When they go to 1st grade, they're learning it at a deeper level and at their developmental appropriate level, and again in 2nd grade. So I feel confident that students are building on their knowledge through the grades. Another big piece, again, back to that, is are these standards developmentally appropriate? Can young students learn these standards that are so rigorous? And I say yes. In my classroom, my students are learning through play. We just implemented full-day kindergarten, and the students did fabulous. It was a fantastic year, and we made the commitment. Our students will play. They will learn through play. You can come into my classroom and you can go into the Dramatic Play Center, and students are making grocery lists where they're stretching out the sounds and words. They're shopping for items by the beginning sound. They're doing sorts for different categories, all through a Dramatic Play Center. One big piece that sticks out for me is that I am laying foundational skills for our students paired with an engaging application of their knowledge. So I decide how they're going to learn that standard. The standard is set, but how am I gonna, it's my job to teach them in an appropriate way that engages them and that makes them excited about their learning. Like I said in the beginning, I was concerned. I read one of the first standards that I had read was about decomposing and composing numbers. And I thought, how can you expect a 5-year-old to take a teen number and know that that's, the number 15 is 10 and 5 more? How can you expect that? But my students did that this year. We used technology, and we used manipulatives, and we used appropriate practices for our students to be able to achieve these standards. Another great example is that the writing that my students do. A few years ago, my students wrote fairy tale stories, or they told me about what they did on their weekend. We just finished, my students wrote opinion pieces on school rules that they thought were important, and they had to support that. They were thinkers, they were critical thinkers. Their thinking was amazing to me. It was so exciting because I brought them to a point where we'd practice thinking and practice using what we know to support our thinking, and they did that. I think one important piece for anyone is taking the standards and really reading them and kind of breaking down the language. I think the language can be intimidating, like counting and cardinality. Can our students count? Will they count to 100? Can they count by tens? Can they use, coins are not in the Common Core at this point, but do I still use coins with my students? Absolutely, because I know it's a way that they can learn to count by tens, or we use them to count the days that we've been in school. So even though it's not in the Common Core, we still bring that information to our students. We still share that knowledge with them. One big piece is the assessment. And I think that because Common Core is so streamlined and I have such a clear set of standards that I'm teaching my students, I'm sure that they're reaching mastery. So I can give a formative assessment on text types. And then if my students were not sure that if that was a fiction or a nonfiction text, because the Common Core is so streamlined, I can pull that group and I can reteach that skill. In the past, I can remember thinking of all the GLEs, there were so many. And there are still a lot of standards, and I do see them as overwhelming at times, but I know that if I teach certain standards, my students, when they're faced with another standard, they'll be able to do that. And another great thing that Common Core has brought to my classroom are performance assessments, where my students are taking the knowledge that they've learned in the standards and they're applying them to real life situations. Just recently, we were learning about common animals, and we made informational text to share with people at an animal shelter when they were adopting a cat. They could say, these were the things you needed to do to take care of a cat. And that was a real life connection for them. They were so proud to share those books and to feel that they had such an important role. And I think Common Core has helped us to bring performance tests into our classroom. And they'll see those on the Smarter Balance, right? They'll see those kind of questions posed to them, going back to how can we really use this? And to think that I think, even as children are just starting their educational career with me, will this skill, what I'm teaching them, will it help them be career and college ready? To kind of bring it back, where do I see my students now after 2 years? I think they're thinkers. I always tell them, be thinkers. And they're problem solvers. And they know how to apply their knowledge, where before it might have just been a rote application or a rote time that they were telling me, just counting. Instead, they understand why they have to count and why it's so meaningful. And again, their learning is streamlined. And then for my teaching, I see it as focused. I see the standards as high standards. I want my students to all be learners and all be successful. And I think that from my teaching perspective, in my teaching, I give my students the opportunity to be critical thinkers and to be thinkers. And I think that the reading and the writing and the math really drive my instruction. So, thank you.
So, yeah, it's called Biggest Volume. Thank you for coming tonight. I have to stand. I'm just used to standing in front of the classroom. I'll do my best here with the 10 minutes. I'm with 12-year-olds all day, every day, and I haven't had 10 minutes of attention in like 3 months. So, okay. Those are put on the homepage on your
The desktop?
yeah.
Bear with me, everyone.
So I've been teaching 17 years with just 6th graders. So my perspective, while not unique, is I think interesting. I've taught 6th grade math specifically all 17 years, so I have seen a pretty good evolution where we were basically 2 decades ago to where we are now. And when I think about when I first came to New Hampshire and I started teaching, I did probably, and I say this somewhat sheepishly, what probably a lot of first-year teachers do. You're just getting your feet wet, if you will. I opened the book, and I kind of went through the book sequentially. And at the time, it was, I believe, that New Hampshire, I think it was just the standards were the New Hampshire GLEs, some of which, and again, I say this sheepishly, some of which I didn't pay a lot of attention to because I just kind of went through the book. But as the years rolled along, and as I eventually got my master's, I started to take a look at the standards, and this happened, well before I got to this district, of course. So, and then you start to think, well, how can I best teach this? How can I hit all my auditory learners? How can I hit my visual learners? How can I hit my kinesthetic learners? How am I going to assess them? Does it have to be a paper and pencil test? Can it be something else? And so you kind of evolve. Well, you do evolve, and I think you get a lot better at it. And that's why I think when I look at teaching, I think a lot of people could do what I did my first couple years of teaching. I open a book, explain a couple problems, do it a couple different ways to show them, and hopefully they'll get it, and you move forward. But I look at now, teaching as an art. It's not just something I think anybody can do. I want to look at a standard and think to myself, how can I best teach it them? Does it have multiple entry points? Meaning, most of my classes are, while they're 12-year-olds, they have a wide range of abilities. We have, if you came to our science fair, you would see kids who are exploding eggs in microwaves, all the way up to kids who are building, looking at artificial gravity, looking to create artificial gravity with a centrifuge. The abilities are wide. So when I look at my lessons, I need a lesson that's got multiple entry points, and then of course, or conversely, if you will, multiple exit points. So with that, I need to find, what sources out there, whether it be my teaching partner, the internet's opened up a wide range of resources for me to teach to them. I can say that when we first moved to the Common Core a few years ago, we looked at the standards. I sat down with my fellow 6th grade math teacher, or my fellow 6th grade teachers in both Hollis and Brookline, and we were like, wow, this is going to be a very daunting challenge. And it was. And this is kind of an unscientific observation, it felt like we were almost pushing the kids ahead a grade level. Probably in hindsight wasn't a grade level, but we were definitely going to be teaching them things that we taught in the spring or never taught before. So it was somewhat nerve-wracking because we had all these common assessments that we had to build to test, and you obviously wouldn't be a successful teacher, and you want your kids to have success, and so there was some anxiety with it. And we knew that by jumping head first, jumping right in, that there would be a curve, if you will. Well, 3 or 4 years later, we knew that, as those, probably the kids I have now were probably 2nd grade when they were introduced to the Common Core, maybe 3rd, that learning curve, or that curve that it would take to where we want them to be, has drastically shortened. When I talk with Melanie, about the Common Core. Mind you, I've got 2 young children, so as you can probably recall, I've kind of been in a fog a bit the last 5 or 6 years as a parent and a teacher. So I didn't really realize there was a big buzz about the Common Core until I went on the internet and started looking at all the different forums, whether it be the Hollis Brookline Journal, et cetera, and realized there's a lot out there. I just don't really think of it anymore as the Common Core. I think of it as, here's a standard, how do I best teach it? And you can call it the GLE, the CC Common Core, you can give whatever initials you want, but it's a standard. It's just, hey, here's what I need you to teach. Use your background knowledge, use what you went to college for to do it in the best, most appropriate manner. And so what I wanted to do, kind of just kind of put you in my shoes. Tomorrow we have field day, so it's gonna be a fun day for all of us. But Wednesday, this is the standard I'm going to be teaching to my students, and it's just basically in a nutshell, working on finding the volume of rectangular prisms. And I know it's a big, meaty, if you will, weighty, wordy piece there. So to me, I talk with one of my fellow teachers, and over the years you kind of develop, you find things that work best for you. And so I have this lesson that we're going to do. It's called the biggest volume. And just if you don't mind, I'm just going to kind of walk you through what it is that I'm going to attempt to do. And please keep in mind this is June, and with 12-year-olds whose attention span is definitely waning at this point. So I'm going to be teaching the biggest volume, and I just want to kind of, in my head, I want to lay out, or on paper somewhere, I'm going to lay out kind of my lesson stages with it. But anyways, again, I want to think to myself, this is kind of they were introduced to volume in 5th grade, so I know that. But I want to go back, because I do have multiple abilities within my classroom. I know that some of my students might not be at the level that their neighbors are. So I want to, like I said, I want to bring in that kinesthetic, I want to bring in the auditory, I want to bring in the visual piece. So I'm going to be introducing them, we're going to be making boxes, if you will. So if you can kind of picture these as these are going to be cutouts, if you will. And my students are going to make boxes. I don't know how well you can tell there, but we're looking at boxes that are made of the exact same amount of material. Which one will have the greatest volume? And so we're going to be using the hands-on material so they can see it and really introduce this concept and go with it. I got my little box in there that is going to give them that good background knowledge. Again, this is a Common Core standard. It's June. I think I can hold them to this. Now I said earlier I don't want to just have my lessons be for one specific ability or not. So I want this to be open to multiple entry and exit points. So this is going to be essentially what they're going to find. So I was glad to see that none of my students are here, so you can kind of see the answers ahead of time. But this is going to be, for the students, this is kind of like the baseline. This is where I want all my students to be able to get, to figure out the volume of the various box dimensions up there. But I want to, like I said, I want to open it up for students who might be able to go a little further with it. So what I might do next for my, I don't call them fast finishers, but those kids who quickly pick on, hey, well, what happens if we change the dimensions from a whole number to a fraction? And I believe in the standard there even referenced fractional dimensional lengths. So they can kind of figure out, oh, whoa, we're going a little bit bigger. So the biggest volume may not be a whole number. And from there, if students want to, they might even go a little further where we're not just looking at the halves, but we're actually looking, we can kind of narrow it down and kind of cover that idea of limits and maximums. So again, that's like my little extension there, just trying to give that lesson that multiple entry exit points for kids who want to go a little further with it than, say, others. And even a little bit further when we bring in the whole technology piece. That's one of the things I was really impressed with the Common Core, is just the amount of technology and the expectations with technology. So again, the buzz about the Common Core, I didn't realize there's as much as some of the backlash that's been out there. I just look at it as a standard. I kind of have two choices, or I don't have two choices. I got a multitude of choices. I could just open up our textbook and do it. but I believe there's a real art to our teaching, a real challenge of being a great teacher. I think it's very hard to be or it's very good, it's not too hard to be a mediocre or decent teacher, if you will, but it's very hard, I think, to be a good teacher. And I think all of us strive to be a good teacher. I want to take that standard and I want to see where I can go with it. Let's go as far as I can with it. How I doing, right? I don't know. So anyways, Thursday, I got one more lesson with my students. And I have to explore and I'm not there yet, but we got to explore the volume of triangular prisms. And I think the candy bar is called the Toblerone. Toblerone, I said that. And so I'm trying to, that's where I'm at now. I'm trying to think where I can go with that. So I think a greater conversation might not be, do we get rid of the Common Core and adopt something else? But hey, it's here. Here's some standards. What are some great lessons that we can do with our students that have those multiple entry and exit points and that will hit all of our learning styles? So, in conclusion, if you got a lesson on the Toblerone candy bar, see me afterwards. Thank you.
I love Toblerone. Hi, my name's Evan. I've been teaching at Sanborn Regional High School for 7 years now. Prior to that, I taught for a year. I taught English composition at the University of New Hampshire, and I taught for almost a year in Poland at the University of Krakow. So I have some diverse perspective, I think, on the Common Core standards here. I think that the thing to look at are the standards themselves. You've heard from a number of teachers now that what is the buzz of the Common Core? From our perspective, there's not much buzz. We look at the standards, and if we look at them and really read them, we'll find that they are very rigorous. So I just want to spend a few minutes going over some lessons that I have that link to the Common Core. A few things before I start, though. The curriculum itself is set by the local school, not by the Common Core. The Common Core is a set of skills and standards, but the curriculum is decided by the local communities. The texts themselves are very rigorous. I find it laughable when people say, the Common Core isn't rigorous enough. By the way, I'm the drama director at Sanborn as well, so I had to bring in some props for you. Just a second, bear with me. Is that one not working? How's this? Whoa. These are some of the books that I teach. These are some suggested readings on the Common Core site, but I think that you'll find that they are quite rigorous. Hamlet, Shakespeare's mentioned a number of times in the Common Core. I can't say it in the theater because you can't say this title in the theater, but it's the Scottish play by Shakespeare. 1984, I teach my students Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, The Catcher in Rye, The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien, Ernest Hemingway's Sun Also Rises, Our Town by Thornton Wilder, Waiting for Godot, Samuel Beckett, As I Lay Dying, William Faulkner, and if anyone suffered through a William Faulkner book, they'll know how hard it is. I happen to absolutely love Faulkner. Night by Elie Wiesel, The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald, Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five, Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God, and of course, The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck. I think that what you'll see here is a very high level of literature. And this is what's being taught in the schools. I've heard that there's this 70-30 split between literary texts that should be taught and informational texts, and more of an emphasis on informational texts. And the important thing to keep in mind there is that the informational texts are shared across the curriculum. So a science teacher reading a textbook or a scientific article or some instructions on how to build something, those are informational texts, and that counts within that 70%. The vast majority of what's taught in an English class are literary texts. Yes, there are times where we teach informational texts, and I'll speak about that in a moment, but we really are teaching literature and poetry and drama. So here are a few lessons that I've been working on, and this is how they're connected to the Common Core. I have a handout in the back. I don't know if you picked it up on the way, but these are the standards themselves. And if you have questions on the legitimacy of the standards, or if you have questions on whether they're rigorous enough, please give them a read. The first one here, the first reading standard, Literacy RI 11-12.1, it says this: cite strong and thorough textual evidence to support analysis of what the text says explicitly, as well as inferences drawn from the text, including determining where the text leaves matters uncertain. When I teach The Great Gatsby, we can talk about any number of things, but when a student raises their hand and they say, I think Gatsby's a jerk, I say, yeah, that's fine. Where in the text do you see that? Point to me the passage that says that Gatsby is a jerk. Because if it's your opinion, that's fine, but anything that you have to say about the book came from the book itself. So let's go back to the book. Let's cite evidence. And by teaching students those skills, we're then teaching them to apply them later on in life. If they were to read a newspaper later, and they made a claim about what an article said, you would ask them, well, where in the article does it say that? Is it just your opinion that you're imposing upon the text, or does it actually say that in the text? Let's closely read the words in the book. And that's what we're teaching our students. I don't think that that's a controversial idea. I think that's something that we would all agree with. Another lesson that I teach my students, we talk about the Holocaust. Very, very important topic. And as a way to do that, as our anchor text, we talk about Elie Wiesel's novel, Night, about his time at the concentration camps. If we teach students just one piece of the Holocaust, it doesn't give them the context. So just teaching them the novel and understanding what the characters said doesn't really do justice to the book itself, and that's where some informational text will come in. I ask students to watch a documentary by the BBC on the rise of Adolf Hitler to give some context to how the Holocaust came to be. I bring in a Holocaust survivor to school, and they listen to the first-hand account of someone who was there. They watch Schindler's List. They also read statistics on who went where, what the numbers were across Europe. They also read newspaper articles that are primary documents of the time period. All of that collectively is what gives students context for what it is that they're learning. Just one novel won't do that. That's how we learn. That's how we explore the world, through multiple media. And if you look at the standard here, 11-12.7, it says, integrate and evaluate multiple sources of information presented in different media or formats, examples, visually, quantitatively, as well as in words, in order to address a question or solve a problem. So I presented them with a number of sources that they then have to understand. What have I asked them to do with it? I'm asking them to write a paper that addresses the following question. How is it that we can understand, remember, and teach the Holocaust in a way that prevents genocide in the future? What we've done here is we've taught students the content, we've taught them the skill of closely reading multiple sources, and then we're asking them to apply it beyond the classroom and beyond the text itself. That, to me, is a very rigorous way of teaching. That, to me, is a fully developed way of teaching. And it's the Common Core standard that really anchors that. You've heard a number of teachers address that same thing. I think Jenn said that we learn the content, we apply the skills. I like that, we apply the skills there. And Ms. Jordan also said that we teach learners how to learn. By reading closely the text, you can read anything after that and really understand the world. The final piece I want to show you, I got my 2-minute warning here. So I have students write a research paper. And the research paper asks them to develop their own original thesis statement. And the student who wrote this paper here did a fantastic job. And these are all of the drafts and all the work that she put into her 8 to 10-page research paper. She had to first develop a hypothesis. She had to research the hypothesis through academic search engines like EBSCOhost. She had to come up with an annotated bibliography. She had to take those sources, break them down, understand what the sources were saying before she could even write the paper. So she had to demonstrate to me that she knew what she was doing before she could then go ahead and write the paper. Then we went through the drafting process. She did 4 drafts before her final paper. She had an individual conference with me where we got to analyze her specific work. and then she was able to write the final paper. That shows an enormous amount of work, an enormous amount of research and skill on her part. And again, that's rooted in the standards here. If you went to research to build and present knowledge, literacy 11-12.7 and 11-12.8. I've given my 2-minute warning, so it'll take me the rest of the time to read that. But if you want to look at those, you'll see that that's the type of assignment that's going on in my classroom, and that's the type of assignment that's linked directly to the Common Core. Is the Common Core good? I think it's great. Is there controversy around it? I'm not really sure why. When you read these standards, I think that they're very difficult to argue with. Thank you.
Tammy, do you want to talk from down there? Tammy. It's up to you.
Hi, I have a 7-week-old, that's why I'm down here. I'm actually on maternity leave, so please excuse me if I'm in the fog that was mentioned a little while ago. I also have a 2-year-old at home. But yeah, I spent some time actually thinking about school today, which I've done a very good job of not doing for a few weeks while I deal with the little one. So I thank Logan for helping me out with my little bugger over there. So I met Bill Duncan at a conference a few weeks ago, and then when he called me and asked me if I would come in and do this, I was like, oh, I don't know if I can be a teacher for an evening right now. I'm kind of in little kid mode, but I think it's really important for people to know what we're doing here at our school with the Common Core standards, and really what we've been doing, because I think what I keep hearing, like, I was kind of in the same, like, really, like, why are people all worried about this? Like, these are just standards, we've always had standards, like, what's the big deal? But people are really worked up about it, so I think it's important that we help you understand where we are coming from and what we are doing with it. Honestly, I think I have a very similar opinion to the people that you've heard so far of we've been meeting standards and, you know, revising what we do from year to year and making sure we're doing what's best for our students in front of us all along, and this is just the current set of standards that we're working with. We've talked a lot about them in our department. You're going to hear from my department head right after me, so hopefully I don't say anything wrong. If I do, I'll just blame it on being on maternity leave. But it's a great out right now. But I just wanted to tell you a little bit about one unit that I teach. I teach predominantly Algebra 2. I've been teaching, I've got 16 years behind me at this point. I have a master's degree in education. It's the 3rd school I've taught at, but I've been here for, I'm not sure, 6 or 7 years, I think now. And I've taught Algebra 2 almost all of the years that I've been teaching. It's been the rare year that I haven't taught that particular course along with some others. And one of the big things in Algebra 2 is quadratic equations, quadratic functions. It's really important, you know, anytime you're talking about hurling something through the air, whether it's an airplane or a softball, you're fundamentally working with a quadratic equation even if you don't see it. So one thing I did a few years ago, I went to a conference put on through NCTM, and actually what you'll find is if you look at the Common Core standards, you're basically looking at stuff that NCTM has been telling you for a really long time. Most of what's in the Common Core standards is not really new from a math perspective. It's just a reorganization and a structuring, trying to put each thing in its most appropriate place so that we don't spend our time spinning our wheels doing the same thing over and over again. But we do things when kids are ready, and when they're ready, we try to do it really well. And so quadratic functions comes up in Algebra 2, and it's a big part of what we do. One second. If you want to take it out back, it's okay. Like if you want to walk out back. Sorry, I just know you don't want to listen to my screaming kid while I talk to you, so we'll get him out of here. One thing I do also want to mention before I talk about my particular lesson is that there's not just content standards, there's also standards of mathematical practice. And I think the standards of practice, there's 8 of them, are almost more important than the content standards. And it's the standards of mathematical practice where I think we feel most pushed to make changes for the better of what we're doing. And I can tell you within our department here at HBHS, a lot of what the practice standards ask us to do are the things that we've been sitting in meetings saying we want to do and trying to figure out how to do, and this is just giving us that push to work even harder together to do more of it and to go further with it. So I think for the most part you're going to see that we are ready and willing and able to push ourselves even further than we've pushed ourselves before with the extra motivation of these standards, but that nothing that these standards are asking me to do isn't something that I'm either not already doing or haven't been wanting to do for a really long time and just needed a good excuse to like finally make it happen. So this quadratics unit that I teach, I start out with this program called the Quadratic Transformer. I didn't write it, I found it on the internet, and my kids either go into a computer lab or work with laptops, and they do a lot of exploration with families of functions. And this is one thing that I'm actually really excited that the Common Core has a greater emphasis on the idea of families of functions and functions in general than some of the standards that we've seen in the past, whether local or national. And it's something that I've been doing in Algebra 2 for quite a few years, and I was like, hey, they're doing what I've been saying, yay, that makes me happy. I had nothing to do with anybody who wrote these things, and so I'm really excited that somebody agreed with me about this. So when I look at the standards, a lot of what I see is stuff that the good teachers I know have been doing all along, and this is sort of almost validating what we're doing and then pushing us to go even further beyond. So I start with this quadratic transformer. Kids work in small groups with a computer. The computer enables them to explore the different forms of a quadratic equation and to see, well, when I do this to the equation, what happens to the graph? And then if I flip over and look at this other form of the equation, how is that reflected? What's going on in the graph in the equation? So they really start digging in there and looking at the technical mathematics from a graphical perspective as well as from the function perspective and even some of the calculations that go behind it. And after they've spent a day or two doing this, they get the reward of they get to play Angry Birds in class. And I'm not saying that because I want your kids to think I'm cool, because they get disappointed really quickly when they find I'm not cool at all, and I make them do math with Angry Birds. And so I'm like cool for like 5 minutes, and they're like, oh my god, now I have to write an equation, are you serious? Yes, I'm serious, I am Mrs. Leonard after all. So they play Angry Birds, and you can see the parabolic trajectory on the screen, and we're very fortunate to have smartboards in our classroom, so they play Angry Birds on the smartboard. They can see that parabolic path, which can be modeled by a quadratic equation. I can capture that image, throw it into Geometry Sketchpad, which we're also very fortunate to have use of here. And I can then figure out, I can decide where I want to put it. So I can put the vertex at the origin, I can put one of the x-intercepts at the origin, I can make the x-intercepts a positive and negative version of the same number, like I can manipulate it however I want to steer them in different directions of the things that they've been looking at in that previous activity. And so they do this, and this is how we like lay the groundwork for what the quadratics unit is going to be all about, because it's like the biggest unit we do out of the year. And then we spend some time doing some of those more traditional units where I give them some notes and then some in-class practice problems, and they go home and they do homework to practice that stuff that I need to reinforce. But they've had the groundwork laid, and then as we get further through the unit, they then get into groups and work on a problem set that asks them to apply all of that stuff that they've now been learning with factoring and x-intercepts and maximums and minimums, all these things that are spelled out in a wide variety of standards in the Common Core. And I ask them to take those and apply them to what we call real-world situations. And yes, they're written down like math problems, but they're situations that come up either in daily life or in specific occupations or whatever it is. But they take those things, they work collaboratively in groups, and they're applying that knowledge in a specific situation that's then going to be useful to them. So when I look at this unit, which is a series of lessons, I don't usually look at it and say, okay, I have this one standard, and what one lesson can I teach to make this one standard? If I looked at every standard by itself, I would feel like I could never get through them all in a year. But I just started as like an exercise today, while both kids were thankfully asleep at the same time, looking through this lesson and looking back through the standards and going, how many standards can I find in 5 minutes that are being addressed just in those 2 lessons of the quadratic transformer where they're on the computer, and then the Angry Birds where they're starting to apply it. And I could quickly find like 7 or 8 content standards that are being addressed, specific things that I'm required to teach them. But then it also hits like 3 or 4, maybe even 5 of those practice standards that inform how we teach the content. So this kind of what was being said before, this is what good teachers are trying to do, and this is what we're trying to do here. We don't look at it and go, oh my goodness, there's this long string of things I have to do, and how am I ever going to get through this long string of things? The fact of the matter is, in previous years teaching Algebra 2, I was teaching almost all of these things anyway. Some things I wasn't. Some things I've looked at and gone, ooh, we used to do that in pre-calc, and now we're going to do that in Algebra 2. How are we going to make room? Well, some of this stuff is going to move to Algebra 1, and they're going to be ready for it because of the work that they did in 7th and 8th grade that they didn't used to do. So things are kind of shifting around somewhat, but the bulk of what I'm going to be doing in Algebra 2 in the future is basically the Algebra 2 content-wise that I've done in the past. The shift is going to be that I'm going to keep getting pushed to do those more creative things, to bring in all those different elements that I've been trying to do all along, but I'm going to be encouraged to do more and more and more. And I have to say that I feel really lucky to work with this particular faculty because I get to sit down and say, hey, what ideas do you have? And one of my colleagues and I will sit down and we'll develop a lesson together, or somebody will already have one and I can just use it. We love to steal from one another. We're very giving that way. We're very pro stealing from each other. But it means that our kids end up with the best of all of us in that group. So I would say, please don't panic about the Common Core. I can tell you that when I first saw it, it looked like a really big document, but so much of it is what we're already doing, or at least what we wanted to be doing. Don't panic, it's going to be okay.
And I guess I'm the last one, good news, bad news. I have a lot of different experiences that I bring to the table. I've been here at Hollis for 12 years. I've worked in the Ozarks, I've worked in the inner city, I've worked in suburbia, and now I work in Hollis. I also ran a small business for a number of years when I lived in Philadelphia. I was also the director of engineering students. I was women in engineering students at Drexel University. So I've seen a lot of different places and a lot of different types of educational systems. As I look at the Common Core, I think that we really want to look at three things, and that would be curriculum, practices, and assessment. I think that's what people are concerned about. Again, as other people have stressed, the standards are not the curriculum. Here in Hollis, every year we have about 115 students take calculus, and we have about 50 students taking AP statistics. You don't get to that place without a very rigorous, strong curriculum. We have it, or we wouldn't have that number of students taking that level of mathematics. We are not changing our curriculum. In fact, the Common Core curriculum, there were only four state standards that were in our state GSEs that were not addressed by Common Core. And we had addressed them anyway in our curriculum. There was one standard that's a Common Core standard that we did not address in our curriculum, and that was vectors. We did that in pre-calculus. We did not do it in Algebra 2, and we're going to have to shift that down to Algebra 2. I think we need to think about what kind of students we want to produce from Hollis Brookline. What is that person that's going to be successful in the next world that's coming up for them? It's different from our world. We want them to be creative. We want them to be problem solvers. We want them to be able to collaborate with others. And we want them to be able to communicate. I was recently at a workshop in Washington, and as I was waiting for the airplane in this lounge, there were a number of men standing around a computer, and it was really interesting to see what was going on. They were showing all four of those types of activities. They had, from what I could pick up, they had to develop, by that evening, a presentation to give to a university who did not like their service that they were providing, nor the fee that they were charging. And so together, they used all four of those skills, and each person on that team was able to collaborate and bring to the team their expertise. And I thought, here I am trying to do this in my classroom, and I wish I had this on tape. I wish I could take this back and show the kids, this is what we want you to be able to do. A number of students have come back to me who have gone through our high school, and they've graduated from college, and they're going out for job interviews. They don't sit down and say, please tell us why you'd like to work for us. Recently, a student told me he went to a job interview at IBM. They said hi, they gave him a problem to solve and said, we'll be back in a couple hours. He got the job because he had all of those skills of creativity, collaboration, communication, and problem solving, critical thinking. So in all that we do with the Common Core, especially in math, it's a lot less about the standards because they're just the same. Nothing's changing. Our curriculum is not going to change here at Hollis. It's going to be the same. Next year, we're still going to have 120 students in calculus, and we're still going to have 50 students in AP Stat, and everything in between. The big change that I see is in the practices, and Tammy spoke a little bit about that. In the practices, there's a number of different things that we're going to address, and let me just read them real quickly for you. One is we want students to make sense of a problem. We want students to be able to persevere. We want them to be able to reason abstractly and quantitatively. We want them to be able to construct viable arguments. We want them to be able to critique the reasoning of others. We want them to be able to model with mathematics. We want them to use appropriate tools, calculators, computers, programs, strategically. We want them to be able to attend to precision. We want the right answer. We look for and we make use of structure. And finally, we look for and express regularity in repeated reasoning. The way that we're going to achieve this, I think, and Tammy again made some reference to it, is switching how we teach. We need to incorporate more problem-based learning, where I present the students with a problem and they solve it. And they call this, the guide on the side is the teacher. The kids go through the problem. They know why they have to use the mathematics. It's not a question. I'm not going to make them do 10 pages of solving quadratic equations without showing them, without giving them the experience where in real life this is applied. And I think this is the biggest thing about Common Core that's going to force us to teach in this new way that will create learners for our next century, or this century. I think the other thing we want to keep in mind, whether we like it or not in assessment, the SATs will be using these new types of problems. We want our kids to pass the SATs. We want them to do well. Colleges will be looking at them. The PSATs will change also. That determines the national merit scholars for the country. I think there is no more prestigious scholarship than that one, and our students must be ready, and we must prepare them for that. The SATs, the new SAT, will be for students that are now freshmen. So by the time they're juniors, we need to have them in that place. I think it's spring of 2016. They'll take the PSATs in the fall of 2015. They have questions out there now. They are just like what they're asking us to use our new practices to give to the students in Common Core. That's about all I have.
Before we go to the Q&A, Representative Gargasz and I just wanted to give a little commentary about the forum and the use of the standards. My daughter asked me, why are you doing this, Mom? Why don't you help children in Africa? Other people that need help. Well, one of the reasons is that in 2010, I was on the SAU Strategic Planning Committee. And what we learned on that committee, something that just cannot leave my mind, is that the kids that are in school today are learning for jobs that have not yet been created. So they really have to think differently. They really have to be problem solvers and critical thinkers. And I think that this Common Core is on the right track. I have been supportive, yes, I'm pro, but I'm not without knowledge or realization that it's not perfect. And in my estimation, what we need to be doing to make it perfect is to keep working with our teachers, with our administrators, with these folks from the Department of Education and the Board of Education. So as a representative, I'm committed to doing that. And I just want to, again, thank the panel. You are a tremendous panel. Thank you all for taking time out of your day to join us and share with us. And before I give Representative Gargasz the floor, I just want to say a saying that I've heard before that I love, and that is, teaching is a career that begets all careers. So our teachers are very important, and what they're teaching is important. So again, thank you very much.
As I was sitting here listening to these teachers, I think I would love my grandchildren to be in their classes. But it made me think of something many years ago when there was a desperate need for teachers. I took a job as a second grade teacher. And let me tell you, those kids survived in spite of me. And what it did was it gave me a great respect for teaching. But about tonight, the way I explain this is I was hoping people would come to learn about Common Core, what it is, and what it is not. And I've been talking to people around the state who say their communities have adapted it, oh, I forget which is the right word. And it's the standards, it's what we've always had. We've had standards, and these are the latest standards. And it sounds like our teachers are doing an outstanding job of translating what it means and putting it into practice. So I really want to thank you all.
Okay, so now we're going to go to our Q&A. We have about a half an hour, and I thought we could find some kind of, relationship between the questions that we have, and they're kind of a lot of different questions. So, I'm going to pose some questions. I'm going to ask somebody on our panel to respond, and I may even tap into somebody who's out in the audience to respond. Representative Myler. Okay. Right. Okay, this one has to do with the math standards, stop at Algebra 2. How can these prepare kids for STEM programs without pre-Cal that were in California's standards, and Cal that were in California standards? Dot?
Yeah, I can speak to, oops, is this on? Is this on?
Let's
It's kind of taped up. He's going to turn it on.
While you're answering that, you might be able to also answer how the standards address accelerated programs. Okay, thank you. Well, that's quite convenient.
Hello. Oh, there we go. Okay. The standards don't address those upper-level mathematics courses because we don't see all students taking those courses, needing those skills. We see the skills that are identified in the Common Core as necessary for all students. Everything after that becomes very specialized. So the students going to STEM, they'll take pre-calculus, I hope, and calculus here. And the accelerated students, we will always offer, at Hollis Brookline, we will always offer AP courses, honors courses, accelerated courses for those students. That will not change here. We are dedicated to that. That's what we do, and I don't see any place where that's going to change. We really honor those students who take on the challenge of the APs and the honor sections, and we want to encourage that.
We have a couple questions that refer to benchmarking with international countries. Would anyone like to take that? Heather? Thank you.
I don't know, I can answer, but I can try.
Oh, I'm sorry. Do you want me to be more specific? Okay, can you expand on the quality of education in the U.S. as it relates to other countries and how Common Core is designed to help improve the U.S. education standing? Thank you for the question.
Sure, absolutely, and thank you very, very much. There was a lot of research done before the Common Core was developed by states and teachers within states. And part of that research that was accomplished during that period of time, and even as the Common Core was starting to be developed, was around what are other countries doing? And so we looked at countries that were scoring very well on the PISA, the international assessments and so forth, and said, well, what is happening over there? What kinds of standards do they have in place in other countries that we can learn from? And so we used those to inform how we were developing our standards here. So when it comes to what they call internationally benchmarked, what it means is that we used international standards, and standards was very important, standards from other states. You hear Massachusetts often referred to as having really good standards. And so we used all of that information as good researchers in education should, and we were able to determine what would be the best standards for the country. Best, again, as Ms. Dodd just mentioned, the best minimum standards for all of our students. And so we were able to use that. So when you hear the term benchmarked, it means that it was an informatory process. Do any of our teachers want to mention?
Yeah, I'd like to add a real fun fact that I read. As we become a very competitive global economy, the number of the top 10% of students in India is the same as the total number of students we have in the United States. So think about that for a minute and what that means 40 years from now in an economy that will be global. It's kind of really interesting to think about what that means for our children and the jobs that they will have.
Okay, I have a couple questions revolving around the state and federal government. As far as the state is concerned, we have one question. When was the legislature consulted? Did they vote to move Common Core forward? And when? And I know that we took a vote in about the May time frame, and there was a bill, what was it, 1508? I'm not really good with bill numbers, but there was a bill to get rid of Common Core in New Hampshire, and the legislature voted against that bill. There were also several bills that dealt with the smarter balanced testing, and we deemed to study that, and also study assessments. I don't know, can I tap into you, Representative Myler, for, I don't know if you have any past history. Representative Myler's with us, he's on the Education Committee.
You're correct.
Oh, okay, I'm correct.
I just,
Yeah.
to add something, the legislature has not ever, as far as I understand, developed standards. That has been the job of the Board of Education, which Mr. Raffio is chairman of, not the Department of Education. And it takes a while to understand the differences. There's the Board of Education, the Department of Education. We've done very little in the legislature with actual curriculum, and I'm not actually sure if I recall correctly, but I believe it was the legislature that voted to require civic education in high school, 1 semester of it. But that was very related to what I consider the legislature's job. But someone can correct me if I've got this wrong, but there's, the legislature in general is not involved in standards.
Before you leave, would you like to read the next question?
Well, let me just add to that. The state board, in the beginning, I talked about the process that we went through for a couple of years. We were knee-deep into this. We don't vote for things on the State Board of Education without knowing our stuff. So we did vote for it. You heard Heather describe the process, the benchmarking process. You heard me describe the fact that 217 educators from across the state gave us feedback on the standards. So that's our role, the State Board of Education. What the legislature does approve is what's called the minimum standards, which were recently approved. But then they are consistent with the Common Core. But that is also a separate process that the legislature, in fact, though, does approve.
If I may, I'll just add one more thing with the question about how the legislature was engaged in the process. This, just in full transparency, was before my time at the Department of Education. However, in looking through notes and former emails and those kinds of things of my predecessors, there were over 30 forums held around the state with over 2,000 to 3,000 teachers and parents engaged in the drafting process throughout the state, and all of those forums included legislators. In addition to that, we had one-on-one as well as formal conversations with legislators all along the way, especially those on the House and Senate Education Committees and those over the Legislative Oversight Committee. So just to round that out.
Heather, we'd like to also ask you a question about when was the public hearing on the acceptance of Smarter Balance assessments giving parents a voice? Was there a public hearing on Smarter Balance?
Not in the formal sense of like we do with rulemaking. So a lot of people, when they say, and I just want to be, a lot of times definitions are different depending on who we talk to. So there is a public hearing process that's very formal that we go through with what Tom just mentioned with our rulemaking process. That process, however, is not normally used when we're adopting assessments. Instead, what we do is we work very, very closely with our educators around the state, and we've been doing that process ever since we started looking at Smarter Balance, even when we were looking at the PARC assessment, which is another consortium out there of states that have joined together on one assessment. And so what we have done is we've worked with educators around taking, and parents actually, we've worked with quite a few parents on looking at the practice assessment, the pilot assessment, the practice test, all of those things that are available on the Smarter Balance website for any community member and parent, and I really encourage you to go to it. I would start at the 3rd grade level, just saying, but look at what the practice tests are showing you so you can understand what those assessments will look like. So there wasn't the formal rulemaking process that we would normally use because the Smarter Balance is actually not a rule.
I'd just like to add that today from the state I got an email offering, offering an opportunity to be part of a 500-member panel with Smarter Balance. And it's open to teachers, it's open to educators, it's open to parents and community members. And the whole idea behind this 500-person panel is to evaluate the difficulty of the questions and then take those questions based on their difficulty and determine what answers give us the 4 levels of proficiency that we've always seen in the NECAPs. So if any of you are interested, please email me at school. I'll be happy to pass the information on to you. It's a very easy Google Doc to fill out, and it would really be valuable if some of our community members were part of that.
And I'll just add, and it was selected after a real rigorous process of looking at dozens of other options, and the balance assessment was deemed the most optimal, for sure.
Here's another question. What is stopping the federal government from changing the standards of Common Core and using federal funds hostage to get what they want? I know that there is a considerable concern about the federal government and its involvement in Common Core. That was my ad.
So I want to be very clear. Please do not leave this room without this in mind. The federal government, as well as our state government, requires us to have standards in several content areas, but mathematics and ELA are 2 of those content areas. They require us to have standards. The federal government at no time has ever required what those standards will be. The state chose, through a rigorous process of talking with many, many educators, parents, and policymakers, what those standards would be. But the federal government and state government, meaning your General Assembly, as well as congressional leaders or the U.S. Department of Education does not say ever what standards you will choose. That has never been the case.
Is that guaranteed that the federal government will never step in?
Excuse me, sir. Excuse me, we have a format, and
I disagree.
well, we can talk after. Hopefully there'll be some time to talk after. Because this is our format, and our next question, which people are just... Okay, but we're not going to get into a back and forth, or else our questions will be done.
I think I can speak to that a little bit. When people say that the federal government held the local states hostage, which I've heard, what they're referring to is the Race to the Top funding. I want to say that was 3 or 4 years ago, Andy, somewhere around there. And each state was able to submit a project to the federal government and determine whether or not they were going to be funded for that project. There was a list of requirements that each of the states had to meet, and based on how well they met the requirements was whether or not they got funded. And so many people look back at that experience and say that the federal government only provided money to states that were advocating for Common Core. I would disagree with that to some extent because there were many more criteria on that Race to the Top than just do you agree with Common Core. That was only one of many numbers that they put into the whole picture. Was it important? Yes. But they also put in that to get all the teacher unions in your state to agree to merit pay. That was a very high number that you got points for to get your project approved.
And Ms. Dodd, even within that application, that 8% that you're talking about, still didn't say you had to adopt the Common Core. It said that you had to adopt rigorous college and career ready standards. So even within that, and at no point, in fact, the Secretary of Education has recently, within the last week or maybe 2 weeks, has come out and publicly said that no federal funding there will be of consequence if a state or a school district chooses not to adopt the Common Core. So no, there is no ramification from the state or the federal level when it comes to the adoption of the Common Core. It's our decision to do so.
Okay, here's another governance question, and a good question. A solid majority of citizens from both towns voted against adoption of Common Core at the March annual co-op meeting. Why is this vote not given the recognition and respect it deserves? Would anyone from our school boards like to answer, like to help us out with that one?
Yeah, right.
Tom. Okay, Dr. O'Shea, I'm gonna vote.
The information that was provided to us by, I am Tom Solon, former chairman of the Co-op School Board, currently chairman of the SAU School Board. The information that was given to us prior to the district meeting by our legal representative was that it was impossible to have a binding vote on a topic such as that it was functioning as a sense of the meeting. And because as a school board, we do not dictate what the state standards are. As far as adoption goes, the Co-op School Board did not take an individual vote to act on the Common Core state standards in any manner. And to the best of my knowledge, the only action that's been taken by the school boards within the Hollis Brookline community, the SAU 41, are the references, the one-line reference to it in the strategic plan. In that context, it did not fall on deaf ears. And there are discussions going on currently as to how the school board can address the topic Specifically, is this a topic that is permissible to be addressed at the SAU level, or must it, because technically the SAU board does not govern the education within the communities, we govern the SAU administrative area. So we're trying to understand where our legal rights are as school boards to impact it. We're also in attendance at forums such as this to become educated on the topic. So it didn't fall on deaf ears, it isn't ignored. However, at this point in time, it's not clear that the school boards have any power over the way it works. And on top of that, our superintendents, as part of their contract, are required to uphold their legal requirements as set forth by the Department of Education. So we've got to address those things as well. I don't know that that gives you the information you want, but that's my personal impression and my understanding as a school board member. Thank you. James, you want to comment? Dr. James O'Shea, who is the current chairman of the Co-op School Board.
I would just agree with everything that Tom just said. I think, by no means do I speak for the school board, but speaking for myself, it was very important to me to get that input from the district meeting. I do view it as advisory. Certainly the school board will be talking about this at our Wednesday meeting. Certainly the school board is open to any motion by any of its members that will be voted on in public. I personally view such decisions about Common Core to belong with the school board, and I would view input at district meeting that is non-binding as an important, one of many important information pieces. The input of our administrators, our state officials, our teachers are, to me, of equal or perhaps even greater importance. So I would view that as one input, certainly heard, certainly will be talked about, but again, not binding. Thank you.
Here's another question. Does this Common Core guarantee kids will never need remedial classes if they successfully graduate from a Common Core school?
I would say yes. I would hope. We really work very hard to make sure that all of our students right now have that basic, and it's not going to change for Common Core. It's the same as it's always been. The one thing that we've done over the past few years that I think will really help is we've introduced at the high school, and I know at the elementaries, response to intervention, response to instruction, and RTI, we call it CAV block at the high school. And it's a block of time where students can get remedial help if they're not successful. The special education program here at the high school is working very, very hard to move away from just helping kids do their homework to really evaluating what the gap is in their education, what are they missing, what do they need, and providing the specialized education that those students need, not just helping them get an A in math or an A in English, which has typically been what we've been doing. So I really look to all of what we're doing, not just with Common Core, but throughout the whole process that we've changed in the few years, that this response to intervention, this commitment to filling the gap, to testing students. Okay, you don't understand how to do a quadratic equation, and we're moving on. That doesn't mean that the quadratic equation is not important. That means you're going to come to CAV block at the high school and receive remedial help so that you do understand what a quadratic equation is and how it works.
Another question posed to our teachers. What would you be doing different if CCSS never existed, and can we do what we need to do without it?
I would just say, as far as that question goes in the previous question, what we have here are a set of standards that students have to be competent in as they leave our classrooms. We have an awesome responsibility to make sure that they're different from when they came into our classrooms, from when they're leaving. And that is that they've learned these standards. So the guarantees that are put on, I don't know how to say guarantee or not, but they understand these standards. If you have specific questions about the merit of some of these standards, I'd be really interested to hear that, because I think that there's a lot that we can agree on in here as far as those standards go.
I can say that just because Common Core came into my classroom didn't mean that I just stopped teaching and I said, okay, now I'm only going to teach Common Core. I didn't start from scratch. I just enriched my teaching. The students have a richer learning experience. You didn't take all of your curriculum or your standards that you were teaching before. You didn't throw them away. You just Common Core made it a richer experience for our students, and I think their learning goes to a different place. And I think back to those 10 years ago. It wasn't this rich of an experience that my students had, and now they have that. And I think the past 2 years have been using Common Core, it's just been a wonderful teaching experience for me, and I've seen a lot of growth in my students.
Let me just add this. Keep in mind that another great thing about the Common Core is we know where students are. So if someone moves in from Iowa or someone from New Hampshire is moving to another state, we need to know where the students are. So I want to make sure that that point's made. There are no guarantees. It's certainly an aspirational goal in answer to the first question, but I can tell you colleges and universities and businesses support the Common Core because it's getting the students more prepared, not only for colleges and universities, but also real life.
One of the aha moments that I had in the past few years, I was teaching linear equations to freshmen. They could find the slope. If I gave them 2 points, they could find the equation of the line. They could find the y-intercept. They were experts. They were so good. And then the physical science teacher was doing an experiment, and they were measuring the temperature of a substance as it moved from ice to boiling water. So the kids all put their little thermometers in and they measured against time, and one of the students kept the time, the other watched the temperature, and then they all had to sit down and they had to graph that equation and talk about what the rate of change was and where did it start and why was that number in the y-axis. No one in the entire class could tie that to everything I had taught with linear equations because we had taught it out of context. They didn't know what the y-intercept meant when they looked at the graph. They didn't know that's where they started. They had no idea. They had no idea that the slope of the equation, which I taught very, very well, you subtract the y's over subtract the x's. I taught that excellently. But they didn't have any idea at all that that was the rate of change that they were seeing in their graph. They couldn't connect the two. And so that's really what we're trying to achieve with the math program, by moving more toward a problem-based experience for these kids, where they will know what that slope means.
Since the teachers are still talking, I think this is directed to teachers. This is a two-part, or maybe three-part. Will Common Core guarantee that readings and problems are not slanted by what is today considered politically correct? And are the books Evan is using typical of what we find in most English classrooms under Common Core? And would Evan teach any differently if the Common Core standard wasn't in place? Yes, that's yours.
I guess that's my question. The interesting thing about the Common Core is it's not just about the books that a student is reading. The Common Core has suggested text based on the reading level that a student should achieve at a given year. I'm able to know what the reading level was in the previous year, know what books were, but also know what skills were mastered by students so that I can create my lesson plans in a way that builds on that, because these Common Core standards build from year to year. Would I teach differently? I think not, but I think that I'm able to target the skills of my students and what they need in a more accurate way, in a way that, again, builds from year to year. So that's the advantage that I have as an educator, but I don't think it's a different method of teaching. It's a more accurate way of teaching and ensuring that students who leave my classroom know that they've mastered these skills, and I know that they've come to my classroom with certain skills that I can start from. That answers the question.
Here's another one. It sounds as though the creators of the standards did the right thing for the right reason at the right time. So can you debunk the idea that someone is trying to brainwash our kids? Does anyone want that one?
I'm not sure that brainwashing, happens. We teach students, and this is the foundation of academics, I think, is to ask questions. If they're not asking questions, what are we teaching them? That's the point. That's the point of the education. As far as these go, we're teaching them skills. If you read through the standards, I'd ask you again to take a look at the standards and take a look at the skills. If you disagree with those skills, then we can have that conversation. But this isn't about brainwashing. Local communities have control over what's taught in the curriculum. The Common Core does not set the curriculum. It sets standards.
Let me just add, we know this, all the work that we've done from an employer's perspective as well as the State Board of Education. What you're learning now, and someone mentioned earlier in the program, 20 years from now, some of the stuff that we quote unquote memorized when we were kids isn't going to be valid. So really what this is doing is teaching the students to be critical thinkers, and just like Evan said, that's what you want for students to know how to ask the questions, to be problem solvers, to work in consensus and collaboration. That's what we look for as an employer. So that's really what the Common Core is getting at. So it's not brainwashing. In fact, I would say just the opposite, because it's actually teaching you to ask the tough questions and not just accept some, whether it's from the internet or in a book, some fact that you actually want to ask questions on. So I would say it's just the opposite. It's teaching you to be a critical thinker and to ask the tough questions.
Thank you. At this time, I would like to ask if we can stay for another 10 minutes, if you don't mind, because we're almost done with the questions, and I'd really like to be able to address them all. So are you going to kick us out? Okay, thank you. All right. And I hope you don't mind staying for a little bit longer. Okay. Well, the next question I think is addressed to me. Why is there no one on the panel to speak to the disadvantages, negatives of Common Core? And this panel was designed to be an example of what is happening in our schools and why it came to be. So we felt that there was a need to put a little perspective on this, and let's talk to our subject matter experts from the departments and our teachers, the ones that implemented each day. As they talked, they tried to address some of the concerns, and we're also addressing these questions. But I think we really needed to have an opportunity to hear this. Most parents, and I remember when my daughter was in school, I wasn't paying attention to what the standards were. When NECAP was in, and the testing and the NEAS and all that, I wasn't paying attention to the standards. I was looking at her grades and seeing that she was doing a great job. Or if she wasn't, I was in with her teacher. And anyway, she's going to college now. Very proud.
The one challenge that I do see for our school district is being able to move to the practices of Common Core. We do need professional development. We need to know how to move there. We need to know how to provide problem-based learning. How do we move from giving knowledge, giving instruction, to really creating problems, or finding them on the internet that are meaningful to the students, not the train left the station at 10 o'clock and when will it pass the other train. We're not doing that anymore, I hope. They're not meaningful questions. You look it up on the internet, I'll tell you. And so we need to provide those meaningful questions for the students. And I think as a district, we need professional development from K through 12. We all need it. I'm an experienced teacher. I've been teaching for 33 total years, and I'm learning how to do that. I started teaching in 1973, and my idea of teaching was to provide knowledge. Here you will know how to solve the quadratic equation. You will memorize the quadratic equation. If I continue to teach like that, I am not teaching the future of our country.
Here's a question. If districts can select their own standards, then these standards need assessments that are aligned to what they were instructed, not Common Core. How is the New Hampshire Board of Education helping these innovative districts?
Well, I said that right at the top. If any school district, if any city, if any town wants to take the Common Core and enhance them and make them even more challenging, God bless them. That's certainly, they're right. And I think we just had a recent example of that, as I alluded to, the city of Manchester. But if you understand what happened there, they actually took most of the Common Core. So it validated the fact that the Common Core is really the true benchmark. They went a little above in a certain area. So the testing, the balanced assessment testing, will still work if you're teaching your children even more rigorous standards or curriculum. The test will still be fair.
Just in addition to that, this is no different than when we had the GLEs and NECAP. School districts could still choose whether or not they were using the GLEs as is, an adapted version, not at all, those kinds of things. And we still had a statewide assessment required from our state legislature to implement around the state for that one measure in time. And I mentioned earlier that the State Department, as well as the State Board of Education, really supports and encourages multiple assessments in your local district. So let's just say, for example, you decide that you want to use different standards altogether. We are always looking for opportunities to learn about different assessment practices and how that district is using their standards and their assessment practices to improve learning. We do have a current requirement to have a statewide assessment, and that statewide assessment, it has to be based on standards. And so, because the learning is the thing, the assessment is just the evaluation of where kids are. So, but just for informational purposes, this is the same as we had when we had NECAP and our grade level expectations.
Let me do this. If this is so critical and necessary, why didn't the New Hampshire Department of Education develop such a standard locally instead of waiting for a one-size-fits-all from Washington, D.C.?
It's not from Washington, D.C., and the reason why I say it like that is because there's a lot of teachers in every state, a lot of parents in every state, a lot of business leaders, higher education folks that spend a lot of time that never step foot in the U.S. Department of Education. Not once. And I don't want to degrade their work by giving the U.S. Department of Education any credit for the development of those. Okay? Can you repeat the first part of that question again?
If this is so critical and necessary, why didn't the New Hampshire Department of Education develop such a standard locally instead of waiting for a one-size-fits-all from Washington, D.C.?
And that's actually a really great question. That first part is really important because, as you remember, even when we developed, locally is in the eye of the beholder, but even when we developed the GLEs, we did so on a regional basis, right? So we worked with other NECAP states to determine what are those standards that we want students to know and be able to do. What are those? And so we worked collaboratively together with other teachers from other states, and we focused a lot on New Hampshire needs in that area. And I'll be honest with you, when these Common Core standards were being developed, I lived in another state. And when we started thinking, this was out of New England, when we started talking about developing standards that were similar across the country, we said, hey, you know what? That New England, territory up there, they kind of know what they're doing. They're already working collaboratively. How dare we not take the expertise of educators from as many different areas as we possibly can? To build walls around New Hampshire is catastrophic to our children. We must, and you look at any of these teachers and they will tell you they're learning from other peers. It does not just live in the borders of New Hampshire. They consistently network and learn from others, and I'll guarantee you, I promise you, that people from across the country look at our educators in New Hampshire as experts as well. And so it's really, really important for us not to build those walls around New Hampshire and saying that we're the only ones that know anything. We know a lot, and we've got some pretty exceptional educators, and a lot of them are on this stage. But we can't think about it that way in this global society that we work in. We've got to make sure that our kids have the best of the best of the best, And we believe that this is a floor for helping get to where we need to be.
If I could just add, with the grade span expectations that we had at the high school, when I reviewed them and I looked at the state, what the state provided to us, they are the same as Common Core, with a very few exceptions. And they were developed locally. We did develop them. They were New Hampshire's grade span expectations. And we've had them, I don't know for how long, Heather, since 2005, 2006. And that's what we've been teaching from. And they're no different, at least in mathematics, from Common Core. With those very few exceptions, and it doesn't really, it's something we were already doing.
And let me just add, you heard at the beginning, I went over how we had so much input as a state, balanced with the fact that we have benchmark data from other states. But in some respects, just as just was spoken, a lot of what ended up being in the Common Core, it definitely has a New Hampshire flavor. So I think we've got the best of both worlds. We have the benchmark data that Heather described, plus New Hampshire did definitely have a lot of input to what ultimately came out of it. And I described several examples of that. And by the way, the panel of teachers that we have, when we're out on the road, we do state board meetings at different schools all the time. This group of teachers is very representative of how the teachers in New Hampshire have engaged the Common Core. So clearly they were also part of the process of developing and helping to shape the Common Core that we have in New Hampshire.
You made a good argument that the old New Hampshire standards were really bad. Why was no one raising the red flag back then?
I don't know that anyone said they were really bad. I don't believe, I hope I didn't say that they were really bad. We just believe that there's always a cycle for revising standards and based on best practice, promising practices, and those kinds of things. And it was our time to start looking at those kinds of standards, and we wanted to increase our pool of experts around that based on what I just said before.
One thing I've heard said is that the previous standards were the minimum standards, and now we call it the Common Core standards, which seems a little more of a positive take on it. That's just one comment I've heard, and I don't know if anyone has any comment on that.
I mean, I don't know if I have a good comment on it, but I mean, it's when we talk about any kind of standards that are used, adopted, endorsed, whatever word you want to use, at the state level, we always talk about standards that are good for all students. That's why you commonly hear us talk to them as the minimum standards for what we, the problem we get into is that there's the minimum standards in the document that Tom talked about, and then we have the curriculum standards, all of those kinds of things, because we like to confuse things. So, but the Common Core standards and those two content areas, which is really important, even though in ELA we have across the content reading standards, you know, we just believe that when you start with a minimum, a floor, if you will, minimum is probably not the best word, but a floor of what those standards are, then there's always the expectation you're going to build from that, whether it's AP courses or the accelerated courses that you talked about earlier. That's really, really important to make sure that we're meeting the needs of all students.
Okay, we have another question. Actually, there's two that are very similar regarding testing. What does Mr. Raffio mean by there is no option to opt out? Does that mean families cannot choose to opt their children out of testing? Or is he referring to districts not being permitted to opt out?
Well, just take it from the district perspective. And there was just, I know the Nashua School Board, for example, just wrestled with this and the legal opinion, and Heather can say it a little bit more detail. You cannot opt out of, at this point, the balance assessment, and you can take the individual question.
So when it comes to the district, as Tom just mentioned, there's no waiver, we don't have a waiver authority at the Department of Education. The state law that was developed by the General Assembly requires all districts to participate in the statewide assessment. It also mentions that all students will participate. So if a parent comes and asks for their student to opt out, there's no formal ability to allow that to happen. And you know, if you keep your kid home, that's going to count against the participation rate. And I would encourage you to allow the teachers to have some kind of, use this as an assessment tool or an instructional tool in their classroom, certainly. But there just isn't, we don't have the authority to give a waiver. There's just not that provision in law. And the waiver is a very technical term when it comes to state governance. And we have to have legal authority to be able to provide those things, and we just don't have that authority.
Heather, do we have the ability to opt out before with our other forms of testing?
No.
Okay, so it hasn't changed.
No.
Okay, just a couple more quick questions, and then we can go. Do you guarantee that costs will not increase? Answer that.
So it depends on where your school is at. So because of Common Core, will your costs increase? No. If you are on a cycle, and I'm not sure where Hollis Brookline is in their curriculum and instructional materials cycle, but most school districts are on that, on some kind of cycle where they update their instructional materials. A lot of school districts are moving away from textbooks and using more online resources and those kinds of things to make sure that they're always up to date. But depending on where you are, but that's not because of the standards, that's because you're going into new instructional shifts, or material shifts. That's just a common practice within school districts. So it just depends on where you are in your process. And the reason why I'm saying it like that is because I don't want you to see a instructional material increase in 2 years because in the budget and think it's because of Common Core. 90% of the time it's not going to be that way. We do have some schools that have told us, you know what, our instructional materials are 20 years old, and we're using Common Core as a reason for updating our instructional materials. I asked them not to do that because of that very question that was just asked. You're updating your instructional materials because it's important that your students have updated instructional materials. And so that's a real important key. The other side of that question is the testing side of it. And the state is required to pay for statewide assessments. That has never been a burden on school districts and will continue not to be.
And we just support that with school districts that have implemented. So as I mentioned, Pittsfield, through our normal curriculum review cycle, this is what Heather said, we've used the Common Core standards to revise and update our curriculum. We provide an ongoing professional development for our faculty anyway. Relative to technical costs, we have also not experienced any impact in that regard either. The new standards have been implemented in all our classrooms, and implementing the standards has to date required no increase in the district-approved budget. So through the normal process of refreshing, there's obviously going to be costs, but they're not directly related to the Common Core.
Last question. Isn't there billions to be made by businesses if Common Core is implemented? Isn't there billions to be made by businesses if Common Core is implemented?
Not sure the genesis of that question. I would say from the other side, though, it's going to allow businesses, and Fred can speak to this as well, to actually get employees who are ready to work, who have those analytical skills, those problem-solving skills, those teamwork skills. So it's going to put your students to be more prepared for colleges and universities, but also life skills. So that's how I'm looking at it as an employer. Fred?
Let me make two final comments. From a business point of view, that's what I'm here to represent. Number one, many of the businesses in New Hampshire, technology businesses in particular, are going out of state and out of country to find their talent. They can't find it here in enough numbers. They're finding some, but not enough. But beyond that, let me just make a second comment. Complementary to Common Core, which is rigor, is relevance. The application of what they are learning from a rigorous curriculum. And for businesses, the relevance is a big piece of this. Let me give you an example. There's a company up in Charlestown, New Hampshire called Whalen Engineering. And one of the things they make are signals for vehicles, the turn signals. That's just one of the things they make. So they bring high school students and middle school students into the manufacturing floor on a regular basis all year long. And they'll be in there part of their school day. And what they do is they see the application of much of what they're learning on the manufacturing floor. And in one particular school, the buses in that district some of them needed new turn signals. So the kids who had learned about these turn signals on the manufacturing floor and how they're installed, literally installed the turn signals in the buses. So that's relevance beyond perhaps what most students would find themselves involved with. But the point is that relevance is complementary to the rigor. And for businesses, that becomes very important. Let me finally say that there's a lot of good teaching going on in this state. And the standards that Common Core represents are just lifting up the challenges that these children and students have to really adapt themselves to and to be challenged by what Common Core requires. But the key to me is that the teachers still can teach. They can still teach the way they feel students will learn. Standards are standards. Curriculum and teaching are local to the schools and to the district. And for businesses, that's real important.
Melanie?
Thank you.
The question what they're asking is about the need to invest in technology resources solely to
take the
administer
test.
the assessments and the connection to the Gage Foundation.
Okay. May I represent? That's actually, we've heard that question quite often. Trust me, Bill Gates doesn't need any more money, so it's not really about that. The Gates Foundation has been supremely invested in education reform for a very long time, but that's not why New Hampshire got engaged in this conversation, so let's put Bill on the side over here for a second. The piece around investment in technology, if your school district currently is meeting the minimum standards for technology based on the minimum standards guides that every school district has to apply, right? Then you have the technology available to take the Smarter Balance assessment. Nothing more is required. Actually, it's very minimal what is required for assessments. So if you have the tools in place that meet the minimum standards, and I can promise you Hollis Brookline does, from the information that you've provided to us, you meet the minimum state standards for technology, then you can take the assessment. Remember, the assessment is over a 12-week window for all your students. Right now, NECAP is over 2. So there's plenty of time in there, and we'll set some parameters up in there, working with educators to help that process along. But as long as you're meeting the minimum standards, then you're fine. And if you're not meeting the minimum standards, that's a whole other question about your ability to not Hollis Brookline, but if any other district in the state is not meeting the minimum standards, then that's a conversation about your ability to meet the needs of students in a technology world.
Thank you. For those of you who do not know me yet, my name is Andy Corey. I'm the incoming superintendent starting July 1st. Melanie asked me to close tonight, and I wanted to do so by thanking both groups. In March, there was a forum over at the barn, which I was able to attend, and tonight's forum here. I think the information surrounding the questions you've asked have provided me valuable knowledge that I can work with our teachers, our boards, our parents, community members, and I look forward to moving forward with this very difficult question that we're wrestling with. In closing, I want to thank this wonderful panel and our two state representatives for sponsoring the event, and I thank you all for coming, and I wish you a safe ride home.